Hey guys, tonight we step quietly through a set of heavy wooden gates. The kind iron hinges creak just enough to remind you that centuries of hands have pushed them open before yours. A chill presses in as the outside world falls away. The street noise, the gossip of merchants, the laughter of children, all of it muffles behind you. You find yourself standing in a courtyard paved with worn stones, weeds poking through the cracks as if, even here, nature insists on having a say. The walls are tall, a little damp, and heavy with the smell of moss. You're inside a convent, and whether you're here by choice, family arrangement, or punishment, well, you probably won't survive this lifestyle without at least a few complaints. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since we're about to close the gate on the outside world, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. It always amazes me how these little journeys gather listeners across time zones, like a silent choir we never see. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take another step into the courtyard. The first thing that strikes you is how quiet it feels. Not empty, just tightly wound, like silence has a density of its own here. You hear the drip of water from a spout into a stone basin, the shuffle of sandals on cobblestones, the faint echo of a door closing somewhere down a corridor. Even birds seem to hush when they cross overhead, as though the air above the cloister itself enforces a vow. The smell of baked bread drifts from a side hall, faint and warm, battling against the chill stone. And you realize how your senses sharpen when distractions vanish. No market stalls shouting prices, no carts rattling on cobbles, just a few sensory threads to pull at: water, bread, stone. Your eyes lift to the cloister walkways, those arched corridors that line the courtyard. A few figures glide along, their habits brushing softly with every step. The fabric is rough, practical, dyed in colors that suggest humility more than fashion. Yet there's still something theatrical in how identical they look, moving in sync like silent extras in a long-running play. Historians still argue whether the convent was a place of true freedom for women, offering education, stability, even influence, or a gilded cage where daughters were tucked away to save family fortunes. The truth, as usual, is tangled. Some women chose this life, finding refuge from dangerous marriages or endless childbirth. Others? They were shoved in before they could even spell the word vocation. You can picture the moment of entry, can't you? A teenage girl, maybe 13, maybe younger, led through these very gates by a father who believes this is a noble act, or by brothers eager to divide her dowry among themselves. She clutches her little bundle of clothes, maybe a cherished trinket or ribbon, knowing that the walls won't easily let her out again. And tonight you're walking right beside her. There's a ritual to entering, of course. The novice's hair might be cut as a sign of detachment from vanity. Her clothes replaced with a plain garment. She's handed a candle, a prayer book, or sometimes just silence. Even if she's too young to grasp it, the message is clear. Life is about to shrink into rules, and those rules will be as heavy as the stone all around her. A quirky detail you wouldn't expect? Some convents had an actual theatrical ceremony for entry, like a mock funeral. Imagine lying down in front of the altar while a cloth is drawn over you, as if symbolizing death to the outside world. Then, when it's lifted, you rise as someone new, not a daughter or sister anymore, but a bride of Christ. Theatrical, yes, but also a little terrifying if you're 15 and just wanted to play lute in peace. You step deeper inside, brushing your hand along the wall, and the texture surprises you. The plaster isn't smooth, it crumbles in places, cool and grainy. You wonder how many anxious hands touched the same spots over the centuries, looking for something solid. The convent's architecture doesn't dazzle like a cathedral. It isn't about grandeur, it's about containment. Corridors snake into each other, some leading to prayer, others to workrooms, some just looping back on themselves like a maze designed to remind you the outside isn't yours anymore. And every hallway has the same smell: wax, stone dust, faint smoke, an olfactory wallpaper that settles into your clothes. A bell tolls in the distance, low, deliberate. It doesn't sound like an invitation so much as a command, and even though you've only just arrived, your body responds. Your shoulders stiffen, your step quickens slightly, like some ancient part of you knows bells don't wait. One mainstream historical fact worth holding on to: in the Middle Ages, convents weren't just religious retreats, they were also hubs of literacy. Some of the most beautiful manuscripts, those jewel-toned gold-leaf pages you've seen in museum displays, came from behind these very walls. Without convents, whole chunks of knowledge might have crumbled away into oblivion. So yes, while life here could feel suffocating, it also preserved civilization, one ink-stained hand at a time. Still, you can't shake the awareness that not everything fits neatly into holy ideals. Behind every veil and rosary is a real person with an itch they can't quite scratch. A novice staring at the wall during evening prayer, secretly dreaming about the orchard outside. An older nun remembering dances from her youth, humming tunes she's not supposed to. These walls hold as much suppressed laughter as they do hymns. You step into the cloister hall and notice a wooden bench polished smooth from years of use. Sitting there, you can hear faint giggling from behind a half-open door. Maybe a novice tripped over her own robes, or someone's trying to mimic the abbess's stern voice. Forbidden laughter already leaking through the rules, even here at the threshold. That's the thing. These convents were never as silent or pure as the official image suggested. People love to flatten history into neat categories: holy versus sinful, pious versus rebellious. But walk these halls with me and you'll see it was always messier, more human, always a balancing act between devotion and desire, obedience and the tiny rebellions that kept people sane. And tonight you've just taken your first step inside. The rest of the night will wander deeper, through bells, beds, gardens and shadows. For now, the gates are closed, and the outside world is just a memory beyond the stone. The bell you just heard doesn't fade politely. It lingers in your chest, vibrating against the ribs as if to say, "This is your heartbeat now." You find yourself turning instinctively toward its source, because here inside the convent, bells are not background noise, they're the boss. They tell you when to rise, when to pray, when to eat, and, more importantly, when not to. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of phone notifications, only you can't mute them, snooze them, or pretend you didn't hear. You follow the faint trail of sound into a stone passageway. The air is cooler here, and your footsteps echo against walls that seem designed to bounce every sound twice, maybe as a way of reminding you that silence is never total. Ahead, the cloister arches open into a small chapel where the bell rope dangles, frayed at the edges from countless tugs. A sister gives it one last pull, her sleeves slipping back to reveal hands, calloused not from farming or swordplay, but from decades of rhythmically pulling at this cord of command. This is how your day begins. Very early, earlier than anyone sane in the 21st century would tolerate. Long before sunrise, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, the bells call everyone from bed to the choir stalls for matins. You're half asleep, hair mussed, eyes burning with the weight of interrupted dreams. And yet, you shuffle forward because everyone else does, and because not moving would feel louder than the bells themselves. Historians still argue whether this rigid schedule offered spiritual clarity or just chronic exhaustion. On the one hand, waking in the middle of the night to sing praises supposedly brought you closer to heaven. On the other, try singing in harmony when your voice is cracking from sleep deprivation. Angels probably covered their ears more than once. But beyond the fatigue, there's something strange about this rhythm. It dismantles your sense of time. In the outside world, a day flows sunrise to sunset. Inside the convent, it's diced into fragments, matins in the dark, lauds at dawn, prime when the sky blushes, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at twilight, compline before bed. And then the cycle resets again and again until the days blur, like rosary beads, slipping endlessly through your fingers. You might think that sounds monotonous, but there's a weird relief in it too. Once you surrender to the bells, you don't have to make decisions. No more, what time should I eat? Or when should I sleep? The bell decides, a medieval life hack for decision fatigue. Still, imagine the frustration. You're finally having a pleasant dream, maybe about sneaking figs from the orchard or dancing in your old village square, and just when you reach the best part, clang. The bell doesn't care about your dream boyfriend or your pretend vacation. It's time to get up, rub your eyes, and chant in Latin you might barely understand. A quirky tidbit that always makes me smile. Some convents train cats to respond to the bells right alongside the sisters. Picture a furry little tabby hopping down from a windowsill at the sound of Compline, weaving between habits on its way to the chapel, perfectly punctual. That, my friend, is a level of discipline most humans still haven't achieved. You trail behind the procession of sisters into the chapel. Their sandals slap softly against the flagstone, the sound measured like a metronome. No one hurries, but no one dawdles. Each step matches the rhythm of the life they've been given. And when they gather in the choir stalls, voices rise, not strong, not weak, but steady. The chants float upward, curling around the arches, as if the very stones were trained to carry them. It's beautiful, yes, but also relentless. You wonder if beauty can survive repetition without dulling into obligation. The sisters' faces show traces of both, some radiant with devotion, others shadowed by fatigue. Maybe one is silently counting the minutes until she can crawl back into her straw mattress. Another closes her eyes and really does lose herself in the words. Same chant, different hearts. When the office of prayer ends, the bell tolls again, dismissing you as briskly as it summoned you. There's no applause, no lingering. Just the shuffle of sandals back towards cells and workrooms, the smell of wax snuffed out as candles are pinched. Already the rhythm is tightening its grip. Pray, move, stop, start, pray again. You step back into the courtyard, and for a brief moment it feels like the air expands. The garden dew sparkles faintly in the first grey light of dawn. A novice lingers too long, tilting her head to catch the fresh morning scent before an older nun nudges her forward. Even small moments of rebellion spelling a rose, pausing to watch the sunrise, are caught, corrected, folded back into rhythm. Mainstream fact, these bells weren't just for the sisters inside. Many convents rang them loud enough for nearby villages to hear, structuring time for the entire community. Farmers ploughed by them, bakers timed their ovens, children learned the rhythm of days not from clocks, but from the convent's call. Think of it as a medieval public service announcement system, useful, unavoidable, occasionally annoying. But as you glance upward at the bell tower, another thought creeps in. Was it a blessing or a leash? Did these bells hold society together, or just keep everyone obedient, one clang at a time? Historians can't quite agree because the answer depends on whether you value stability or freedom more. You take a deep breath and the air carries a faint metallic tang, maybe from the bell's bronze, echoing through stone. For the first time, you realize you're already syncing with it, your thoughts, your steps, even your breath. The convent's rhythm doesn't just shape your day, it's shaping you. And as the sun finally spills across the walls, you can't help but wonder, when the bell rings next, will you obey without thinking? Or will you remember, if only for a heartbeat, that silence belongs to you too? Ever wondered what it feels like to fall asleep in a place that insists you wake up before your dreams have even settled? Tonight, you don't have to imagine. You get to slip into the novice's first night inside these walls. Her bed is simple. A straw-stuffed mattress on a wooden frame, narrow enough that you have to be careful rolling over or risk greeting the stone floor. The blanket scratches, the pillow is barely stuffed. It smells faintly of hay and candle smoke, because nothing here is ever entirely free from smoke. You can feel the chill that sneaks through unshuttered windows, sliding down the back of your neck like a drip of melted wax. The novice pulls her knees close, the habit already alien against her skin. She used to sleep under softer cloth at home, or maybe she curled up beside sisters and cousins on a pile of blankets in some farmhouse loft. Now the bed is hers alone, and the silence is not gentle. It presses against her ears until the smallest noises expand, the scurry of mice in the rafters, the wind whining through a crack, the distant cough of someone older and unwell. Historians still argue whether novices truly embraced this transformation or whether most were terrified out of their wits. Surviving records often come from abbesses writing polished accounts meant to impress bishops, not confessions of sleepless, shivering girls. But now and then in margins of manuscripts you find little doodles, flowers, faces, even animals that hint some novices coped with boredom and loneliness by sketching their private worlds. The reality check here: you probably wouldn't last a week of these first nights. No phone glow to scroll away your restlessness. No midnight snack waiting in the fridge. Just darkness, the expectation of prayer at ungodly hours, and the unsettling awareness that this might not just be a night. It might be the rest of your life. But even in such strict silence, the human urge for comfort sneaks through. A novice might clutch a small cross carved by her father, fingers smoothing the grooves until splinters prick her skin. Another might whisper a prayer, not from the Psalter, but one her grandmother taught her in the village, a chant to keep nightmares at bay. And then there are the small rebellions. One quirky tidbit tells of novices tucking lavender sprigs under their pillows, technically allowed, since herbs were part of convent life, but still frowned upon if the abbess thought you were prioritizing sweet dreams over discipline. Imagine her stern face at inspection. "Sister, why does your pillow smell like the garden?" Busted by aromatherapy, centuries before it was a spa trend. You shift on your own imagined cot, and you notice how the straw crunches faintly. It itches your ankles, pokes your elbow. The discomfort is deliberate. Sleep here is not meant to spoil you. The logic was simple. If your body never grows too comfortable, your soul stays alert. In theory. In practice, you toss, you turn, you sigh so loudly that the girl 3 beds down stifles a giggle. Yes, giggle. Because no matter how solemn the setting, a dormitory full of teenagers will always find a way to break the tension. A whispered joke about the bell ringer's crooked nose, the sound of someone's stomach growling at the wrong moment, even a sneeze that echoes too dramatically can set off a ripple of laughter muffled under scratchy blankets. And yet, laughter here feels risky because footsteps might approach at any moment. There's also the ritual of night prayers before bed, compline, when novices and nuns kneel side by side, chanting lines meant to armor the soul against nightmares and temptation. By the time the prayer ends, the hall smells of beeswax and breath, a mixture of solemnity and simple humanity. Mainstream fact: convent dormitories were often large, shared halls, not cozy private cells. Privacy was rare, and the idea was that constant visibility would prevent temptation or sloth. But here's the catch. Constant visibility also breeds creativity in secrecy. Novices learned quickly how to whisper under covers, how to pass folded notes, how to use coughs as codes. The convent wasn't just a school of holiness, it was a school of stealth. As the novice drifts closer to uneasy sleep, her mind tangles with the sounds around her. One sister mumbles prayers even after lights out. Another snores so loudly the rafters might fall. A window rattles with the wind, and outside, perhaps a dog barks at the moon. The novice wonders if her old bed at home is empty now, if her family thinks of her, or if they've already moved on. You lie beside her in imagination, watching her fingers twitch as though writing letters in her dreams. Letters she'll never send. And when the bell finally tears through the night for matins, it feels almost cruel. She sits up, eyes swollen, body aching, and yet she moves, because everyone else is moving. And if you don't, you'll stand out, That's the true weight of the novice's first night. Not just the discomfort, but the dawning realization that her body is no longer her own. Sleep, wake, pray, eat, repeat. It belongs to the bell now, and so does she. You can feel the straw scratch again, hear the faint laughter under covers, smell the lavender hidden under one pillow. All of it pressed into memory, all of it surviving somehow behind these walls where silence rules, but never wins completely. You shuffle from the dormitory into the refectory, where the smell of bread and beans already drifts in the air. It's not a grand hall. The tables are long, the benches hard, and the light comes mostly from slits in the wall that let in dawn's grey wash. You feel the weight of hunger pressing after hours of chanting and kneeling. But here, eating is not indulgence. It's duty, rationed and ritualized. The meal begins in silence. A sister stands at a lectern, reading aloud from scripture, while everyone else chews slowly. The idea is that your ears feast on holy words while your stomach accepts just enough to keep you standing upright. You notice how even swallowing feels loud here, as though every sip of broth is under divine surveillance, and the food itself? Let's just say this isn't a Michelin star experience. Bread, dense and dark, beans, boiled, until they resemble a greyish paste. Occasionally a scrap of fish or cheese, but only on feast days. Mostly the fare is repetitive, heavy on legumes, light on flavour. Think of it as medieval meal prep for eternal souls. Mainstream fact, monastic rules like the Benedictine rule, strictly limited diet. Meat from four-legged animals was often banned under the idea that it encouraged lust and indulgence. Fish and poultry sometimes slipped through, but beef stew, forget it. The goal was humility on a plate. Still, humans are humans, and cravings don't vanish just because the abbess says so. You hear the faintest whispers. Someone reminiscing about a family feast, about roasted goose with crispy skin, about honey cakes so sticky they glued your fingers together. These memories pass like contraband under the table, warming the meal more than beans ever could. Historians still argue whether fasting strengthened devotion or simply made people perpetually cranky. Chronic hunger can do strange things, visions, irritability, or sudden laughter at the ridiculousness of chewing the same bland beans for the 300th time. And maybe that was part of the test. If you could survive bland beans and still sing praise afterward, surely heaven owed you points. A quirky tidbit? Some convents were rumoured to hide small indulgences. There's a story of one abbess who allowed almonds dipped in honey during certain fasts. Technically still within the rules, she argued, since almonds weren't meat. But you can imagine the sisters savouring those tiny morsels like illicit luxuries, rolling sweetness on their tongues as though it were sin itself. You notice, too, the rhythm of posture. No one slouches, no elbows on the table. Eating here is choreographed. Sit, bow, chew, sip. The soundscape is soft, wooden spoons tapping, benches creaking, the distant voice of the reader. And in the corner, a novice drops her spoon with a clatter. Heads turn, brows furrow, and her cheeks burn red as embers. It's a reminder, even beans can embarrass you here. As you chew your imagined bite of coarse bread, you can feel the grit between your teeth. Sometimes flour was stretched with ground peas or chestnuts, leaving odd textures. Sometimes bread was so old it needed dipping in broth just to soften. Yet hunger levels the playing field. You eat what's set down, you chew until it's gone, you rise when the bell rings again. You glance down the table and see a pair of sisters exchanging a look, half amusement, half longing. Maybe they're remembering childhood feasts. Maybe they're plotting to sneak into the kitchen for a crust of something fresher. Food becomes more than fuel here. It becomes a quiet battlefield between desire and discipline. When the meal ends, bowls are stacked, crumbs swept. Silence continues. No one lingers over coffee, no lazy chit-chat about the weather. The refectory empties as briskly as it filled, leaving behind only the smell of beans and the faint drip of water into basins. The abbess passes last, eyes scanning the room as though hunger itself could betray disobedience. And you realize something. While the rules insist food is secondary, Food might be the most human crack in the convent wall. You can regulate prayer, enforce silence, dictate sleep. But hunger has its own stubborn voice, and it whispers louder with every skipped indulgence. So as you step away, the taste of beans still lingering, you understand why convent kitchens were both sacred and suspicious places. Bread and beans kept bodies alive, but the longing for flavor kept rebellion simmering quietly beneath the habit. You shuffle down another dim corridor and push open a heavy wooden door. The air shifts at once, damp, colder, tinged with the smell of stone dust and wool. You've stepped into the dormitory where rows of narrow beds line the walls like soldiers waiting to be inspected. There's no canopy, no carved headboards, no embroidered sheets, just rough wooden frames, straw mattresses and woolen blankets that scratch the skin more than they soothe it. The chill is immediate. Even in summer, stone walls hoard coolness, and at night that coolness seeps like an unwelcome guest into every joint. In winter, it's worse. You can see your breath puffing pale clouds into the dark. Imagine trying to drift into peaceful, prayerful sleep while your toes stiffen into ice cubes. Romantic visions of convent life don't mention that detail. Mainstream fact, heating was rare in medieval dormitories. Firewood was costly and considered a luxury. Some convents allowed a hearth in a common hall, but the sleeping quarters themselves remained cold by design. The discomfort was seen as a spiritual exercise, a way of sharing in Christ's suffering. Or, if you prefer modern honesty, central heating hadn't been invented yet, so everyone was just cold. You crawl onto one of the cots, the straw crunching like dry leaves. The smell of it is earthy, mixed with hints of sweat and smoke from years of reuse. The wool blanket feels heavy, its fibers prickling against your cheek. It traps some warmth, but not enough. You curl tighter, hands tucked under your arms, a posture that makes you look less like a nun in training and more like a bundled hedgehog. And it's not just the cold that makes sleep difficult. Noise becomes a constant companion. Snores rise and fall like waves, deep rumbles from one bed, sharp nasal whistles from another. Someone coughs into the night, another mutters a dream prayer. The soundscape is communal, unavoidable. Privacy is as rare here as feather mattresses. A quirky tidbit. In some convents, novices shared not only rooms but blankets. Paired under one wool cover, they were supposed to learn humility and discipline. Of course, human warmth was a practical benefit, but you can imagine the awkward giggles, the elbow shoves when one sister hogged too much fabric, the whispered jokes about who snored loudest. Even in the chill, humanity wriggled through. Historians still argue whether such dormitory arrangements kept temptation at bay or invited it closer. Some accounts stress strict supervision, lanterns left burning, abbesses checking the halls. Others whisper of rumours, friendships that blurred into intimacy, confessions filled with longing. Behind convent walls, the line between comfort and sin was thin, and the dormitory was often where it blurred most. You notice how the architecture amplifies everything. The high ceilings trap echoes, the stone reflects sound. A dropped rosary bead can click across the floor like thunder. It's no wonder novices learn to suppress every sneeze and cough. Even a restless turn in bed can draw shushes from tired neighbours. Yet, in spite of discomfort, you feel a strange sense of solidarity. Dozens of women breathing the same cold air, bound by the same rules, sharing the same itchy wool and rattling snores. Misery, in its way, becomes communal. When the bell rings at ungodly hours, you rise together. When a draught sneaks under the shutters, you all shiver in chorus. No one suffers alone, which is oddly comforting, even if that comfort comes packaged with frozen toes. The dormitory also carried superstition. Sisters believed that demons prowled more eagerly at night, slipping into dreams or perching like shadows in rafters. That's why Compline prayers stressed protection through the hours of darkness, and it's why a crucifix often hung at the dormitory door, its presence less about decoration and more about warding off unseen visitors. You lie there, listening to the chorus of snores and coughs, the blanket pulled to your chin, the stones radiate their chill, the straw rustles under your weight. And as your eyes adjust to the darkness, you catch faint outlines, rows of sleeping figures, habits folded neatly at the foot of beds, a novice shifting restlessly in her first week. You realize these nights shape you as much as prayers do. They whittle away vanity, force resilience, and teach you to survive with very little. So the next time you picture convent life, don't just imagine candles glowing in chapels or manuscripts painted with gold. Picture this too. Women curled against the cold, whispering jokes under woolen blankets, trying to find sleep in a hall where silence is demanded but never achieved. Because behind convent walls, even in the icy stillness of dormitories, humanity always hummed, sometimes softly, sometimes with a snore loud enough to wake the abbess herself. The chill of the dormitory still clings to your sleeves as you step outside into the convent's inner garden. Suddenly the air feels softer, carrying the green scent of herbs and damp soil. This is no grand ornamental garden. It's a practical patchwork of narrow beds, each carefully tended, each holding secrets. You trail your hand along the edge of a wooden planter where mint, sage, and rue unfurl their leaves, still glistening with morning dew. At first glance, the garden looks like nothing more than a tidy farmyard within stone walls. But the longer you linger, the more layers reveal themselves. Herbs for healing, vegetables for sustenance, flowers for beauty, and occasionally, just occasionally, plants that had no official place but somehow still grew. You notice a tucked-away corner where violets cluster beneath the shade of a wall. They weren't part of any required crop. Somebody planted them simply because they liked the color. Mainstream fact, convent gardens weren't just food sources, they were pharmacies. Monastic records list dozens of medicinal herbs: comfrey for broken bones, chamomile for sleep, fennel for digestion. In a world without antibiotics, these gardens were literal lifelines. Every leaf and root was potential medicine, harvested by hands that balanced devotion with practical necessity. Still, gardens had a double life. They were workspaces, yes, but they were also sanctuaries. When you bend close to weed a patch of thyme, the world suddenly narrows, the smell of resin, the buzz of a bee, the sun pressing against your back. For a novice desperate for a moment alone, the garden offered camouflage. You could pause over basil plants and let your mind wander to family, to festivals outside, to what freedom might taste like. Historians still argue whether convent gardens were strictly utilitarian or whether they carried layers of symbolism. Some claim that the square beds mirrored the order of paradise itself, a tiny Eden recreated inside cloister walls. Others think that's romantic hindsight, that most sisters were too busy sweating over spinach to feel poetic. Truth, as usual, probably sits somewhere between. And then there's the quirky side. Some convent records complain about nuns sneaking in forbidden plants. A little patch of roses, cultivated despite rules against ornamental vanity, or even more scandalous vineyards. Yes, wine hidden behind convent walls, justified with the argument that it was for the mass. You can almost hear the wink in that phrase. You kneel beside the cabbages, your knees pressing into the dirt, and the smell of earth wraps around you. You can hear the scrape of hose, the faint chatter of sisters working nearby. Work in the garden was one of the few times conversation happened more freely, though always under the guise of coordinating tasks. Pass the trowel could carry a dozen meanings if said with the right smile. There's another layer of the garden too, the bees. Convents often kept hives both for honey and wax. The low hum fills the air now, steady, calming, almost like another kind of prayer. And you wonder, did bees notice the walls? Did they realize they lived in cloistered life as much as the women around them? Or did they buzz out into the world carrying pollen and secrets beyond the gate? You catch sight of a novice carefully tying up beanstalks, her fingers dirt-streaked, her face flushed. She looks younger here, less weighed down by ritual, almost like any village girl tending crops. It's in these moments, hands in soil, sun on the face, that the convent feels most porous, as though walls can't quite contain what's human. Still, indulgence was policed even here. Too much time among flowers could be labelled idleness. An abbess's eyes often scanned not just weeds, but the women weeding. Were you working hard? Were you lingering? Did your smile linger too long as you touched the roses? Gardens could heal, but they could also tempt. Imagine twilight settling over this space. The herbs release their scents more fully in the cooling air. Lavender sharpens, sage deepens, mint sharpens your nose. Sisters gather baskets brushing dirt from their palms, and you, standing in the doorway, realize the garden isn't just a patch of soil. It's a paradox, half labor, half refuge, half pharmacy, half playground for secret longings. Because behind convent walls, even in a patch of parsley, stories grew, some of healing, some of hunger, some of rebellion disguised as rosemary. You leave the garden's earthy calm behind and step into the chapel once more. This time it's not for a quick bell-summoned duty, but for the long hours when prayer saturates every corner. The air is thick with incense, frankincense maybe, or something cheaper, mixed in when coffers ran low. The smoke curls upward like restless fingers, clinging to the rafters until the whole space smells of devotion itself. The benches are plain, carved by hands long dead, their surfaces rubbed smooth by centuries of kneeling elbows. You settle into one, and immediately the echoes reach you, the rise and fall of voices layered in Gregorian chant. The sound doesn't just travel, it circles, bounces, and folds over itself. It's as if the chapel is less a building and more an instrument tuned by centuries of prayer. Mainstream fact, convents followed the divine office, the hours of prayer recited across the day and night. 7 times daily, sometimes 8. If you count the midnight wake-up, sisters gathered to chant psalms, read scripture, and recite litanies. The idea was total immersion in prayer, so life became a rhythm of sacred sound. You close your eyes and the chants settle around you. At first they feel soothing, like warm water lapping against your skin, but the longer you sit, the more you sense the double edge. Soothing, yes, but also suffocating. Imagine being 18, restless, longing for a breeze or a walk, and instead sitting through hour after hour of voices droning psalms in Latin you half understand. You're told to focus on God, but sometimes all you can think about is how badly your foot itches. Historians still argue whether these endless prayers nurtured true spirituality or merely created rote automatons. The abbess might insist that chanting psalms cleansed the soul, but even abbesses were human. Somewhere between Psalm 23 and Psalm 119 you can picture one of them sneaking a yawn behind her sleeve, and yet there's something undeniably beautiful. The way harmony blooms when voices find each other, the way a single high note can slice through the thick incense and pierce the stillness. You imagine the younger sisters stealing glances at the choir mistress, trying to copy her pitch. You picture the older ones humming along softly, their voices cracked but steady, more weathered prayer than polished performance. A quirky tidbit. Sometimes sisters improvised playful versions of chants, slipping in nonsense syllables or parody verses when they were sure the abbess wasn't listening. Think medieval remix culture, hidden humour woven into holy melodies. Of course, if caught, the punishment could be swift, but laughter tucked inside music is hard to erase. The chapel isn't just about sound, though. It's about sensory overload. The stone floor cool under your knees, the flicker of candlelight staining the walls with trembling shadows, the smell of beeswax mixing with incense. Even taste is dragged into it when the smoke lingers on your tongue, faintly bitter, like chewing ashes. And beneath it all, there's the awareness of watchfulness, not just divine, but human. Eyes scanning to see if you nodded off, ears tuned to catch a voice wavering out of line. A novice shifting too much might be nudged back into posture by the stern elbow of her neighbour. Prayer isn't entirely private here. It's a group performance, one where missing your cue could be noticed. Still, as the chants stretch on, something curious happens. Your mind wanders not away from God but sideways into memory. The rhythm of the Psalms lulls you into half-dreams. You picture fields outside the walls, or your mother's face, or the laughter of siblings long gone. And you wonder, are those distractions, or are they prayers too, disguised as longing? When the chanting ends, silence floods back in, startling after so much sound. You can hear your own breath again, and it feels louder than it should. A sister coughs, another shuffles her sandals. For a moment, the human cracks through the divine veneer. As you stand to leave, the lingering scent of incense clings to your robe, weaving itself into your hair, your skin. You realize that chapel life doesn't just stay in the chapel, it seeps into everything. You'll carry the smell to the dormitory, to the garden, even to your sleep. Prayer becomes not just a ritual but a residue, and behind convent walls that residue lingers long after the voices fade, reminding you that devotion here was as much about repetition as it was about revelation. You've barely stepped out of the chapel when you catch it, the unmistakable sound of laughter, not the polite chuckle of an abbess who's heard a witty theological point, but the raw, breathless giggle that slips out when you're trying very hard to stay quiet. It echoes faintly down the cloister hall, bouncing against stone in quick hiccups before being swallowed by silence again. You follow the sound toward a side room where novices are sweeping, the bristles of straw brooms scratching against the floor in rhythm. At first glance, everything looks proper, habits neat, heads bowed, hands busy, but lean closer and you see the twitch at the corner of a mouth, the quiver in a shoulder. One of them has whispered something scandalously funny, maybe about a sister's dramatic sneeze during matins, or how the abbess's rosary beads once snapped and scattered like marbles across the chapel floor. Here's the thing. Humour didn't die inside convent walls. If anything, it thrived as an underground currency. When so much of life was dictated by bells and rules, laughter became a rebellion, small enough to slip under the radar, but powerful enough to restore sanity. Mainstream fact, records from visitation reports, basically church inspectors checking up on convents, occasionally scolded sisters for frivolity or excessive mirth. Imagine the horror. Too much giggling was considered a spiritual danger. Inspectors claimed laughter distracted from prayer, disrupted order, even opened the door to temptation. You can almost hear the lecture, laughter is the devil's tickle. Yet, humans laugh. And even cloistered women weren't immune. They found ways. A candle could become the star of a prank, its wick shortened, so it burned out mid-prayer, plunging everyone into darkness. Or maybe wax dripped strategically onto a bench, so the next sitter had a surprise waiting. Innocent? Yes. But inside stone walls, where days blurred into repetition, these tiny rebellions felt seismic. Historians still argue whether such mischief was widespread, or just isolated novelties. Surviving documents lean toward disapproval, written by those who wanted order. But when you picture dozens of young women trapped together for life, it's hard not to assume pranks were more common than recorded. After all, laughter leaves fewer stains in the archives than ink. A quirky tidbit. One convent in Italy kept a book of jokes, yes, an actual collection of humorous sayings and silly rhymes written in the margins of manuscripts. Scholars debate whether these were tolerated as learning aids or smuggled fun disguised as practice. Either way, they survived, proof that even in solemn halls, comedy carved its niche. You crouch in the corner, watching novices trying desperately to muffle their laughter. One clutches her broom like a staff of seriousness, face reddening as she tries not to break. Another wipes tears from her eyes, biting her lips so hard she'll have marks later. The air in the room trembles with suppressed joy, as if the stone itself is in on the joke. But the danger is real. Footsteps echo from down the corridor. The girls stiffen, eyes wide, hands moving suddenly faster across the floor. By the time the abbess appears in the doorway, the giggles have vanished, replaced with a saintly silence, broken only by the swish of brooms. The abbess scans the room, nostrils flaring ever so slightly, as if sniffing out humour. She lingers a moment too long, then nods curtly and moves on. And then, only when her footsteps fade, comes the explosion. Not loud, not reckless, but a ripple of laughter so fierce it leaves shoulders shaking and brooms paused mid-sweep. You find yourself laughing too, even though you know you shouldn't. It's infectious, irrepressible, proof that joy survives even where it isn't welcome. The convent demanded solemnity, but behind its walls, laughter slipped through cracks, hidden in shadows, carried on whispers. Because sometimes holiness can only survive if it has a little humor to balance it. You step away from the sound of muffled giggles, and the air cools again as you pass into a narrow hallway lined with wooden chests. The smell here is different. Ink, old parchment, beeswax ceiling candles, the faint mildew of paper stored in damp stone. This is the convent's private world of correspondence, a place where words were written but not always delivered. You pause at a table where a novice bends over a scrap of parchment, quill trembling in her hand. She's not copying scripture. No, this is something else. A letter folded small, ink blotted where her sleeve brushed too quickly. Her lips move as she whispers the words to herself, soft and secret. Maybe it's to a brother outside, maybe to a childhood friend, maybe even to someone she wasn't supposed to miss. You can feel the urgency in her strokes, the way each word strains against the rule of enclosure. Mainstream fact, many convents forbade unsupervised correspondence. Letters had to pass through the abbess, who decided what could leave the walls. Some were delivered, but many were intercepted, rewritten, or burned outright. For women trapped inside, the letter was both lifeline and liability. Historians still argue whether intercepted letters were rare acts of control or everyday practice. Some documents hint that entire bundles of outgoing notes were confiscated during episcopal inspections. Others suggest abbesses were lenient, turning a blind eye when messages were harmless. The line between obedience and censorship was never clean. You lean closer and you see the letter isn't finished. The novice hesitates, dipping her quill again, then scratches out a phrase as if even paper can betray her. She tucks the parchment under her sleeve when footsteps sound. A moment later, another sister passes, eyes lingering on the desk just a little too long. Suspicion hangs thicker than the ink. Quirky tidbit: some nuns invented codes to slip past supervision. Invisible ink with lemon juice, words disguised in acrostics, or seemingly innocent scripture verses that, when read in sequence, spelled out names or pleas. One record even tells of letters sewn into hems of habits, smuggled out with laundry. Medieval spycraft, Convent edition. You imagine the heartache of waiting for a reply that never comes. Days pass, weeks blur, the bell tolls again and again, but no parchment arrives. Did the letter even leave the walls? Was it destroyed, tucked away in an abbess's chest, or handed to a priest who decided your longing wasn't holy enough? The silence itself becomes an answer. And yet, some letters did make it. A scrap of news from home, a sibling's handwriting, a smudged word of affection. Those tiny pieces of paper could carry more weight than gold. For a sister who'd long given up hope, a single line might feel like a miracle, proof that the outside world still remembered her name. You step into a small storage room and see a locked chest. You can't open it, but you can imagine what lies inside. Bundles of unsent letters folded tightly, their ink faded but not gone. Whole lives confined to parchment, never reaching their destination. Words suspended in limbo, their writers long gone to silence. The thought lingers with you as you leave the room. Behind convent walls, the loudest voices weren't always chants in chapels. They were sometimes the ones that never escaped the page, the words pressed into parchment and hidden away, waiting for centuries until a curious hand might find them. And as you walk on, you feel the phantom weight of those letters in your pocket, heavy with longing that never found a home. The corridor curves and suddenly the air is rich with colour. You've stepped into the scriptorium, where rows of desks sit angled toward narrow windows. letting in just enough light for delicate work. The smell is unmistakable, ink ground from oak galls, parchment stretched tight, and pigments that shimmer faintly in their jars. Here, silence rules too, but it is a charged silence, broken only by the scratch of quills and the occasional sigh of a cramping hand. On one desk, a manuscript lies open, its pages glowing with careful strokes of lapis lazuli blue and powdered gold. You lean closer, and the light catches a halo that gleams like sunlight captured on calfskin. A sister hunches over the page, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth, her hand steady despite hours bent over that unforgiving surface. Every line of script looks identical, as if her very heartbeat had been trained into rhythm with the ink. Mainstream fact: convents, like monasteries, were centers of manuscript production. Nuns copied psalters, prayer books, and sometimes even texts of science or medicine. Some produced illuminated manuscripts, lavish works with gold leaf, intricate borders, and vivid saints. Without their labor, many texts we know today would have been lost forever. But watch carefully. Not every flourish is what it seems. Tucked into the border of one page, a tiny rabbit peeks from behind a vine. On another, a mischievous face grins from inside the capital letter A. These weren't official instructions. They were tiny rebellions, secret humor pressed into holy texts. Historians still argue whether abbesses knew about these whimsical intrusions, or whether they were sly enough to pass unnoticed. You picture the sisters trading looks across the scriptorium, one coughing softly to hide a giggle as another slips a tiny doodle of a cat chasing a mouse into the corner of a solemn psalm. To us, they're delightful quirks. To them, maybe they were sanity savers in a world of endless repetition. A quirky tidbit: one German convent produced a manuscript where, alongside saints, you find drawings of nuns themselves, some with wry smiles, others playing instruments. It's as if the sisters couldn't resist inserting their own presence into the eternal story, leaving future readers a wink across centuries. The tools of the scriptorium are just as fascinating. Quills cut to precise angles, knives used to scrape mistakes from parchment, pumice to smooth the surface before ink could be applied. Imagine the tension of realizing you've misspelled a sacred word after 6 hours of work. Scrape too hard, and you ruin the page. Too softly, and the ink stain lingers like a bruise. The anxiety was real. Medieval whiteout was basically sandpaper. You lean down and run your finger just above the page, not touching but close enough to sense the texture. Each letter slightly raised, ink dried into the skin of the parchment. It feels less like reading and more like walking across a field of words, every ridge a footprint left by a sister centuries ago. But the work wasn't just tedious, it was physically punishing. Hours hunched in cold rooms, eyes straining in dim light, hands cramping until fingers curled stiff. Some sisters went half-blind from years of squinting. And yet the labor carried status. To be trusted with the pen was a sign of education, of value beyond mere domestic tasks. You look again at the golden halo painted on the page. The pigment gleams unnaturally bright, almost defiant against the dull grey light from the window. That's because real gold was used, beaten into leaf so thin it floated if you breathed too hard. Each application required patience, glue, and a steady hand. The result? A manuscript that didn't just contain divine words, but looked divine itself. Still, you can't help but wonder, did the sisters always believe their labor was holy? Or did some secretly resent spending months illuminating verses for wealthy patrons while their own fingers stiffened with arthritis? Historians still argue whether manuscript production empowered women through artistry or simply exploited free labor. You catch sight of a younger novice sneaking glances at the older sister beside her. The novice's letters wobble, her lines uneven. She bites her lip, determined to match the elegant strokes she sees. The older nun, without looking up, slides a scrap of parchment across the desk, practice lines of Aves and Paternosters, scrawled again and again like handwriting drills. Encouragement hidden under the pretense of discipline. The scriptorium hums with this quiet rhythm: scratch, scrape, sigh, dip. You let the sounds settle into you, almost hypnotic, like rain tapping on a roof. And as you rise to leave, you realize the walls themselves are painted with invisible layers of time, the patience, frustration, artistry, and humor of women who pressed their lives into ink. Behind convent walls, the illuminated manuscripts were not just holy texts, they were confessions, jokes, sighs, and fingerprints, glowing still centuries later for anyone willing to read between the lines. The scriptorium's quiet fades as you wander back into the echoing heart of the convent. Another bell calls and you follow the sound into the choir stalls where sisters are already gathering. The benches face each other in 2 long rows, so no one can hide, every voice is exposed, every mistake doubled by the stone acoustics. You slip into a seat, the wood polished by decades of kneeling, and wait for the first note. Then it begins. The voices don't launch in full force. They unfurl slowly, like a tide inching across sand. First one pitch, then another, weaving together until a single harmony stretches upward. It isn't the kind of music you'd play at a feast. It's measured, repetitive, designed to lift the mind beyond the body. Yet you can't ignore the effect. Goosebumps prickle your arms, your heartbeat steadies, and the air itself feels thick with sound. Mainstream fact, convent choirs were often admired outside their walls. Some were so renowned that patrons donated money simply to hear them sing on feast days. Even though cloisters were meant to be enclosed, voices travelled. Travellers passing on nearby roads sometimes paused to listen through the walls, catching the ethereal beauty of women they would never see. But let's be honest, not every note was angelic. A cracked pitch here, a late entrance there. One sister with a nasal tone that cut through the harmony like a saw. You can almost hear the suppressed coughs, the throat clearings, the sharp glance from the choir mistress when someone drifts off key. Historians still argue whether the perfection described in surviving accounts was reality or flattery for donors. After all, no one wanted to admit their heavenly choir occasionally sounded like a flock of disgruntled geese, and yet those imperfections carried their own charm. Imagine a novice, voice trembling with nerves, her pitch wobbling until it steadies against the stronger voices around her. The harmony doesn't erase her mistakes, it absorbs them, folds them into the whole, like humanity disguised as divinity. A quirky tidbit: some convents composed their own music. In Renaissance Italy, a few nun composers became so famous that their works circulated beyond the cloister, sung in courts and cathedrals. One abbess, Raffaella Aleotti, published motets under her own name, a radical move in a world where female authorship was often erased. Imagine the pride, and maybe envy, within her convent walls when copies of her music reached the outside world. The act of singing itself was physical labor, hours of standing, lungs expanding, voices straining. The cold of the chapel nipped at throats, leaving some sisters hoarse. Others whispered prayers before singing, not for divine inspiration, but for their vocal cords to hold out. The irony, you're told to lift your soul heavenward, but sometimes all you can think about is how raw your throat feels. Still, when the choir reached a peak, voices aligning in perfect symmetry, it felt like the walls themselves dissolved. The sound filled not just the chapel, but your body, your mind. Even skeptics couldn't deny the power. For a moment you weren't just a tired novice or a weary elder, you were part of something vast, eternal, resonant. The choir mistress raised her hand, cutting the air with precision. The voices stopped at once. Silence crashed in, startling after so much sound. Your ears rang, your chest still hummed, and you realized the music lingered long after it ended, an aftertaste of harmony clinging to stone and skin. You glance across the stalls. Some sisters look serene, eyes lowered in perfect piety. Others look exhausted, shoulders slumped. A few exchange small smiles, conspiratorial, as if remembering the cracked note that nearly derailed Psalm 94. Beneath the solemnity, humor, and humanity, always hum. Because behind convent walls, choirs weren't just angelic concerts, they were exercises in discipline, outlets for creativity, and sometimes unintentional comedy, but they were also proof that even in the most rigid lives, voices will find ways to rise and to be heard. The echo of the last hymn still clings to your ears as you make your way toward the abbess's chambers. The air shifts here, less incense, more authority. You can feel it in the polished wood of the door, in the sharper echo of footsteps on the stone floor. When you step inside, the space is plain but deliberate. A sturdy desk with neat stacks of parchment, a crucifix hanging at perfect height, a single candle burning steady and tall. And behind the desk sits the abbess. Her habit is the same cut as everyone else's, but hers seems to command more space, as though cloth alone can radiate power. She looks up, eyes sharp but not unkind, the kind of gaze that can weigh you like a flower on a merchant's scale. This is the woman who rules the convent, not with sword or crown, but with pen, prayer, and the sheer force of expectation. Mainstream fact, abbesses wielded more authority than most women could dream of in the medieval world. They managed property, negotiated with bishops, received donations, and sometimes even held lands in their own right. A powerful abbess could shape not just convent life, but the politics of entire towns. But here's the nuance. Her power was always balanced on a knife's edge. Too lenient, and Rome might send inspectors to scold her for lack of discipline. Too strict, and the sisters themselves might rebel, quietly at first, then more boldly, until whispers reached outside ears. Historians still argue whether abbesses were true rulers or just caretakers under constant surveillance from male superiors. The truth probably shifted from convent to convent, abbess to abbess. You watch her dip a quill into ink, writing briskly, her hand trained to efficiency. Perhaps she's recording the convent's accounts, bushels of grain stored, candles sold, parchment ordered. Or maybe she's drafting a letter to a bishop, artfully balancing deference with subtle defiance. Words were her weapons and parchment her battlefield. Quirky tidbit. In some places, abbesses carried staffs like bishops, symbols of authority topped with silver or ivory. Imagine the sight, a woman in plain wool carrying a gleaming crozier as if she were a general marching through prayer. It unsettled more than one male cleric, who muttered about women wielding too much power. Which, of course, was exactly why abbesses treasured those staffs. You notice a novice standing nervously before her desk, eyes lowered. Perhaps she's here to confess a minor mistake. Laughter in the dormitory, a spoon dropped in the refectory, a letter written without permission. The abbess listens, expression unreadable. Then she nods once, delivers a short penance, an extra prayer, a day of silence, and dismisses her with a wave of the hand. Authority here is swift, efficient, and rarely questioned aloud. But the abbess is not immune to human cracks. You hear rumours, always whispered, that some abbesses bent rules for their favourites, or hoarded comforts in their chambers. A softer pillow, a stash of figs, a ring hidden under cloth. Power invites suspicion, and within walls where everyone sees everything, suspicion multiplies fast. Still, as you watch her oversee the daily order, it's clear. Without her, the convent would collapse. She is the hinge that keeps this strange machine of bells, beans, prayers and punishments running. The sisters may grumble, but they also rely on her discipline to structure lives that otherwise might unravel into chaos. The candle flickers as she signs her name, firm, deliberate, with a flourish at the end. That signature will decide if letters leave, if novices stay, if donations are accepted, if punishments are enforced. It is both the lightest motion of the wrist and the heaviest burden of the house. You step back from her chamber, the image lingering, a woman cloaked in plain cloth, holding the kind of authority most men feared, balancing devotion and politics with every breath. Behind convent walls, power looked different, but it was power all the same. You leave the abbess's chamber and wander into a smaller, darker room tucked against the side of the chapel. Wooden partitions divide the space, narrow booths that smell faintly of wax and old wood polish. You recognize it at once, the confessional. The kind of place where words are whispered not for history, but for heaven, though sometimes the two got tangled. You slip inside one of the booths. The wood creaks under your weight, the seat worn from centuries of restless penitence. A thin screen separates you from the other side where a faint shadow shifts. In this cloister, confession isn't just an act of faith, it's surveillance dressed in holiness. Mainstream fact, confession in medieval convents was often conducted by priests from outside. Sisters were expected to spill their sins through a grate, their words filtered and judged by men who rarely lived the cloistered life themselves. These confessions were written down in some cases, sent up the chain of authority. Privacy in the modern sense was never guaranteed. You lean closer and you can almost hear the whispers, a novice confessing she laughed too loudly in the dormitory, another admitting she drifted into daydreams during prayers, a third, trembling, whispering something about longing she doesn't understand. The words press against the wooden screen, fragile, desperate, sometimes absurd. Historians still argue whether confessors used these moments as genuine spiritual guidance or as a way to control convent life more tightly. Some documents hint at priests scolding nuns for petty disobedience, while others suggest they listened with compassion. And then there are darker rumors of confessors who grew too curious, too personal, blurring lines between authority and temptation. Quirky tidbit, in some convents nuns confessed not just to priests but to each other. Peer confession, if you will. Imagine the awkwardness of kneeling before your dorm mate to admit you stole extra honey from the kitchen. It blurred the line between friendship and surveillance, creating a system where sisters policed each other as much as abbesses or priests did. The screen before you seems to vibrate with secrets. You picture centuries of whispered voices layering over one another like invisible graffiti. A nun admitting envy of a younger sister's voice, another confessing she secretly hated the beans in the refectory, another whispering her fear that she didn't believe enough, that her prayers were hollow echoes. And every now and then, confessions that crackled like lightning, a love letter written, a hand brushed against another too long, a dream so vivid it left someone guilty at dawn. Behind convent walls, even desire was dragged into whispers, where it sat trembling on the edge of wood and judgment. The confessors' responses varied. Some offered absolution quickly as though sins were dust swept away. Others lingered, probing, asking questions that left the penitent squirming. And always the penance followed: recite psalms, fast another day, kneel longer in the chapel. Words traded for rituals, sin exchanged for repetition. You sit there longer than you mean to, listening to imagined echoes. The booth feels smaller with every breath, as if the walls themselves are closing in with centuries of secrets. It makes you wonder, were these confessions acts of freedom, emptying guilt into the dark, or chains that bound tighter, tying even thoughts to the convent's grip? When you finally step out, the air outside feels lighter, but you can't shake the sensation of wood grain pressed against your cheek, of voices lingering in your ears, of sins both petty and profound, etched invisibly into the convent's bones. Because behind convent walls, confession was never just about absolution. It was about control, about intimacy, about the fragile line between what you thought and what you dared to say aloud. You step back into the cloister hall and the air feels different, charged, uneasy, as though the stones themselves are holding their breath. Whispers ripple among the sisters, not laughter this time, but something sharper. A novice hurries past, clutching her rosary too tightly, eyes wide. You follow the current of unease and find yourself before a small side chapel where a crowd has gathered. Inside, a wooden statue of the Virgin leans against the wall, and at its feet a dark stain spreads slowly across the floor. Someone swears they saw it bleed. This is the kind of event that could ignite both awe and suspicion. Was it a miracle? A warning? Or just a leaky roof dripping rust-coloured water onto carved wood? Historians still argue whether such convent miracles were genuine belief, accidents rebranded, or clever stagecraft designed to impress patrons and donors. The ambiguity is part of their power. Faith thrives in the uncertain space where science falters. The sisters kneel quickly, whispering prayers, some trembling with fear, others glowing with joy. One whispers about St. Catherine's visions, another recalls tales of relics weeping in nearby towns. The abbess steps forward, her expression unreadable. Does she believe? Or is she calculating how long it will take before word spreads to the bishop, bringing either glory or trouble? A quirky tidbit. In one French convent, nuns claimed visions of Christ that left physical marks on their bodies, stigmata, wounds echoing his crucifixion. Outside observers rushed to investigate, some convinced of holiness, others certain of fraud. One skeptic noted the wounds appeared most often on feast days, as though devotion itself kept a schedule. You edge closer to the statue. The stain glistens under candlelight, too thick to be dew, too dark to be sap. Sisters gasp, some crossing themselves, others leaning in to whisper guesses. Is this divine presence, or a prank gone too far? In a world without modern testing, the line blurs easily. And then come the visions, at least reports of them. A young novice claims she saw a halo of light encircle the statue's head. Another insists she heard a voice, soft, maternal, urging repentance. The room fills with tension. Are these true revelations or the products of sleepless minds, hungry stomachs and overheated imaginations? You can almost feel the divide forming. Some sisters are convinced, this is holy, this is proof, this is why we're here. Others look wary, muttering that the abbess will be furious if Rome thinks they're fabricating marvels. Belief and doubt circle each other like cats in a cloister garden, neither quite winning. The abbess finally raises her hand for silence. She orders prayers, extra fasting, and, of course, discretion. What happens inside these walls must not leak recklessly outside, not until it can be managed. The sisters nod, but you can tell the whispers won't stop. By tomorrow, stories will grow. By next week, the miracle will either be forgotten or transformed into legend. And you realize convents weren't just homes of prayer. They were also theatres where faith and spectacle collided. Behind convent walls, miracles were currency, suspicion was constant, and the line between mischief and mysticism was thin enough to vanish in candlelight. The crowd around the statue thins, but the unease doesn't vanish. You step away, following the faint smell of dried herbs that lingers in the corridor. The scent leads you toward a low, vaulted chamber where light filters dimly through slits in the wall. Here, beds line the room, simple pallets of straw and wool, but softer than those in the dormitory, for these are not for novices or healthy sisters. This is the infirmary, the convent's sick room. The air is hushed, almost reverent, but not quite silent. A pot of something steams gently in the corner, its aroma sharp, chamomile, sage, and maybe wormwood mingling together. The mixture is supposed to ease fevers, though the bitterness clings at the back of your throat even as you smell it. A sister in a stained apron moves from bed to bed, checking foreheads with the back of her hand, murmuring words equal parts prayer and prescription. Mainstream fact, convents were often centres of medieval healthcare. Nuns kept herb gardens, treated the sick, and sometimes even ran hospitals attached to their cloisters. Their medical knowledge blended folk remedies, classical texts, and Christian ritual. Without them, local villages would have lacked some of the only consistent care available. You sit at the edge of a bed where a young novice lies pale and sweating. Her lips move faintly as she repeats fragments of a psalm, half prayer, half fevered muttering. A rosary dangles from her fingers, sticky with perspiration. Nearby, another sister holds a cup of herbal brew, coaxing her to drink. The liquid dribbles down her chin, staining the sheets. It smells pungent, garlic mixed with vinegar, a medieval antibiotic of sorts. Effective? Sometimes. Pleasant? Absolutely not. Historians still argue whether these treatments genuinely healed or whether recovery was more a matter of luck and faith. Some records praise nuns as skilled healers, others mock their witch-like brews and reliance on charms. The truth probably varied from convent to convent and from herb to herb. Fever might break with chamomile or with thyme. Broken bones might mend with comfrey or with chants. And then, of course, there's the quirky tidbit. Some convents kept relics in their infirmaries, bones of saints or scraps of cloth said to heal when touched. Patients were urged to kiss the relic, sometimes more fervently than they drank their medicine. One abbess even recorded how if fever broke, by the grace of a saint's toe bone. Science? Hardly. Comfort? Absolutely. The room isn't just about medicine, it's about silence. Illness makes sound different, a wheeze, a cough, the slow scrape of a chair as someone settles in to keep vigil. You find yourself listening more than looking. The faint rustle of linen, the creak of a bed frame, the sigh of a tired sister who has been awake for too many nights. You picture how exhausting this work could be. Nuns themselves often lived with malnutrition, poor heating, and endless exposure to illness. They were healers and patients in rotation, tending others today and lying in the same bed tomorrow. The infirmary was a cycle: help, decline, pray, repeat. And yet even here, small rebellions flickered. A novice might sneak honey into bitter medicine to make it tolerable, risking a scolding for indulgence. Another might hum a lullaby learned from her mother instead of a psalm, soothing a patient with forbidden familiarity. Healing wasn't just herbs or relics. It was human kindness in whatever form could slip past the rules. You run your hand along the wall, feeling the cool stone. It smells faintly of vinegar, smoke, and sweat. You realize this place held as much life as death. For every fever that claimed a sister, another recovered and walked out stronger. Behind convent walls, the sick room was both a tomb and a cradle, a place where suffering and survival braided tightly together. And as you step out, the faint echo of a cough follows you down the hall, a reminder that prayer and poultice alike never guaranteed safety, only comfort in the waiting. The scent of herbs lingers on your sleeves as you drift down another corridor, this one broader, lined with storerooms and workrooms. The faint hum of activity guides you toward a space where sisters bend over tasks that are not prayer, but survival. The convent may appear withdrawn from the world, but its economy hums steadily behind these walls. You find yourself in a room where copper kettles bubble over low flames. The smell is unmistakable: yeast, malt, damp grain, beer. Yes, beer, brewed not for tavern revelry, but for sustenance. Medieval brewing produced a low-alcohol drink, safer than water, hearty enough to keep hunger at bay. A sister stirs the mash with a paddle taller than she is, sleeves rolled back, cheeks flushed from steam. Another hauls sacks of barley, her habit powdered with flour, as though she's wandered through snow. Mainstream fact: many convents brewed beer or ale, baked bread, and made cheese to sustain themselves and sell to surrounding villages. Some specialized in manuscript copying, others in textiles. The convent wasn't just a spiritual retreat, it was a business managing supply, demand, and profit. Without trade, cloisters would have crumbled. You trail further and find another chamber where round wheels of cheese ripen on wooden shelves, their rinds pale and firm. The smell is sharp, salty, almost enough to make your eyes water. Sisters move quietly between the racks, turning the wheels, pressing them, testing their firmness. It's a rhythm as careful as chanting psalms, except the prayers here are to prevent mold. Quirky tidbit: one convent in Germany became famous for its cheese, so popular that nobles sent riders just to fetch it. There's even a story of a bishop grumbling that the sisters were more dairy merchants than brides of Christ. The nuns probably laughed all the way to the market. Historians still argue whether convent economies empowered women or tethered them further to drudgery. On one hand, managing production gave nuns independence, skills, and income. On the other, much of their labor was sold to benefit patrons or dioceses rather than themselves. Was it liberation or exploitation in plain cloth? Beyond dairy and brewing, you hear the faint scratch of quills again. A few sisters sit at desks copying charters and contracts for local townsfolk, their work valued for its precision. Another group spins wool into thread, the fibers twined with such care that you imagine how many cloaks and habits began in this very room. The air buzzes with productivity, a different kind of prayer offered through labor. you notice how trade blurred the lines of enclosure. Villagers came to the convent gates to purchase ale, cheese, or manuscripts. Merchants negotiated with abbesses over prices. Even behind walls, the sisters weren't isolated from markets. They were participants, even influencers. Money jingled in convent coffers just as it did in merchant stalls, and with money came subtle luxuries, a new tapestry for the chapel, a finer ink for the scriptorium, an imported spice slipped into the kitchen for medicinal purposes. The abbess justified these as investments in devotion, but the sisters knew the quiet thrill of a cinnamon-scented broth after months of beans. You run your hand along a workbench, the wood sticky with traces of honey and wax from candle-making. The air smells rich, fermented grain, ripening cheese, wet wool, and the faint tang of ink. This is the convent's heartbeat, just as vital as bells or prayers. Without it, the walls wouldn't stand, the candles wouldn't burn, and the sisters wouldn't eat. So when you picture cloistered life, don't just see folded hands and bowed heads. Picture calloused palms lifting cheese wheels, backs bent over steaming kettles, eyes strained over contracts written for outsiders. Behind convent walls, devotion was measured not only in psalms but in commerce, silent trade that kept sacred lives alive. The earthy tang of cheese and malt still clings to your nose as you follow the corridor toward a smaller door, one that opens onto the convent's refectory again. But this time, it's not beans and bread waiting. It's something rarer, something whispered about long before the bell calls everyone in. Tonight is a feast. The long tables are set with a little more care than usual. Extra candles burn, their wax dripping faster in the warmth. Wooden bowls are stacked neatly and a jug of wine, yes, actual wine, waits at the head of the table. The sisters file in, their habits as plain as ever, but their faces betraying tiny sparks of anticipation. You can feel it, the shift in air, solemnity cracking, giving way to something warmer. Mainstream fact, though monastic rules emphasized fasting and restraint, feast days were a regular part of the liturgical calendar. Saints' days, major holidays, or the installation of an abbess often brought better food, wine, and even music. These weren't wild banquets, but they were marked contrasts to the daily monotony of beans and black bread. The sisters sit, and for once, silence wavers. The lector still reads scripture, but the voices of eaters are less restrained, a murmur slipping between verses. Bowls arrive filled with stewed vegetables richer than usual, seasoned with herbs plucked fresh from the garden. A platter of fish appears, its skin glistening in candlelight. And at the center of the table, an unthinkable luxury, small cakes glazed with honey. You can almost feel the collective sigh ripple through the room. Historians still argue whether such feasts were rare indulgences or frequent morale boosters. Some records suggest strict abbacies rationed celebration to maintain discipline. Others describe convents where sisters quietly stretched the definition of a feast day, sneaking more frequent excuses for better meals. After all, who could argue against honoring yet another saint? A quirky tidbit, one convent was known to stash bottles of wine behind the sacristy, reserved for special occasions. Strangely, those special occasions seemed to arrive whenever the cellarer felt generous or thirsty. Inspectors later complained of inappropriate cheer among the sisters, which might be the politest medieval way of saying tipsy nuns sang a little too enthusiastically at vespers. Back at your table, you taste the difference. The bread tonight is lighter, perhaps baked with finer flour, saved for this day. The wine is watered down, but still warms your throat, and the honey cakes, dense, sticky, sweet, cling to your teeth in a way beans never could. You chew slowly, savoring, knowing tomorrow it will be beans again. The atmosphere shifts further as the meal continues. Sisters lean closer, whispering to each other with smiles. A novice giggles openly when honey drips onto her sleeve, and no one shushes her. The abbess, though stern by habit, allows a faint smile as she raises her cup. For a brief evening, the convent feels less like a cage and more like a family gathering. And yet even feasts have rules. No overeating, no gluttony, no drunkenness, Joy, yes, but measured. You can sense the tension. Everyone wants to celebrate, but no one dares tip into excess. Still, when the lector pauses and the choir lifts a hymn of thanks, the voices sound rounder, fuller, as though honey has seeped into the music itself. You step back and watch the candles burn lower, their light gilding every cheek. The feast doesn't last long, but its memory will. For weeks afterwards, sisters will whisper about the honey cakes, about the taste of wine, about the night laughter felt less forbidden. Because behind convent walls, even small indulgences became legend. Tiny rebellions wrapped in sugar and spice, proof that joy could be smuggled onto a wooden table and savoured bite by bite. The sweetness of honey still lingers on your tongue as you drift into another part of convent life, one rarely spoken of openly but always present: competition. Not every convent existed in peaceful harmony with its neighbours. Just as villages quarrelled over land or merchants squabbled over trade, convents too had rivals, and their rivalries could be surprisingly fierce. You walk through the cloister and overhear sisters discussing another convent down the road. Their voices are soft, but their words sharp. That convent supposedly has a more impressive relic, perhaps a saint's fingerbone displayed in a silver reliquary. Pilgrims flock there, dropping coins into their alms boxes, while this convent struggles with only a chipped chalice to show. You can feel the sting of envy beneath the pious tones. Mainstream fact: relics were more than devotional objects, they were economic assets. The more miraculous or famous the relic, the more visitors, donations, and prestige a convent enjoyed. Some houses competed fiercely to obtain them, sometimes even fabricating or exaggerating relics to stay in the game. Historians still argue how far this rivalry went. Did abbesses knowingly exaggerate miracles to outshine neighbours, or did belief snowball naturally from rumour to legend? Surviving records reveal both. Some convents accused of outright fraud, others celebrated for genuine marvels. Either way, competition shaped reputations as much as prayer. Quirky tidbit: one convent reportedly staged a choir contest against a rival, each side performing elaborate chants to win over patrons. Imagine a medieval battle of the bands, except the prize was donations and bragging rights. Records claim the losing convent sulked for weeks, whispering that the victors had cheated by sneaking in professional singers. And rivalry wasn't just about relics or music. Even food and gardens could spark tension. If one convent produced finer wine or cheese, rumours spread quickly. Patrons with wealthy purses tended to donate where they felt quality shone brightest. For cloisters that relied on outside support, reputation was survival. You imagine the subtle digs, a sister here praising our humble but honest relics in earshot of visiting nobles, clearly implying others were less pure. Or an abbess pointedly reminding guests that their choir sang with true devotion, not with vanity like certain others. Even behind walls, competition never really stayed out. At the same time, rivalry sharpened creativity. Manuscripts were illuminated with greater flair to outshine those from rival scriptoria. Gardens expanded, recipes improved, choirs trained harder. A little envy could polish devotion into spectacle. Still you sense the danger. Too much rivalry threatened to undercut the very humility cloisters were supposed to embody. The abbess had to balance ambition with appearances, reminding her sisters that pride was a sin, even as she quietly calculated how to outdo the convent 2 valleys over. You picture 2 choirs singing on a feast day, their voices rising from different cloisters, carried across the same countryside. Farmers listening from fields might compare them, gossip over whose sound carried further. For the sisters inside, it wasn't just about God, it was about winning. So while the convent walls promised seclusion, in truth, they were always porous. Reputation leaked through stone, carried by songs, relics, rumours, and the whispers of visitors. And behind those walls, envy hummed alongside prayer, reminding you that even the most pious houses were never free from very human rivalries. The rivalry lingers in your thoughts as you wander toward the convent's outer hall, the place where outsiders occasionally cross the threshold. A murmur of voices rises ahead, not the soft chanting of sisters, but deeper tones practiced and confident. Wealthy patrons have arrived. You step into the chamber and immediately notice the contrast. The sisters are seated modestly, habits plain, faces composed. Across from them stand two noblewomen in fur-lined gowns, their fingers heavy with rings, their necks glittering with gold chains. A squire hovers in the background, arms crossed, eyes darting around as if even cloister walls could harbour scandal. The clash of worlds is stark, simplicity meeting splendour. Mainstream fact: convents often relied on wealthy patrons, noble families, bishops or kings, to sustain their buildings and daily life. Donations could buy new chapels, fresher manuscripts, or more food for the refectory. In return, patrons gained prestige, spiritual credit, and sometimes influence over abbesses or sisters. The abbess greets them with a nod, her words carefully balanced between humility and authority. She thanks them for their gifts, assures them of prayers for their families, and subtly reminds them that generosity ensures salvation. It's a delicate negotiation, flatter enough to secure funds, but never so much that the convent appears desperate. Historians still argue whether such relationships corrupted spiritual purity or ensured survival. Some abbesses leaned heavily on patronage, tailoring convent rituals to please donors. Others resisted, protecting cloister independence even at the cost of hunger. Every convent danced this tightrope differently. You watch as a novice presents a gift in return, perhaps a small illuminated prayer card painted with gold leaf. The noblewoman accepts it, her face a blend of reverence and condescension. She knows she's the reason this convent keeps its roof repaired. The abbess knows it too. Gratitude and dependency tangle like vines in the air. Quirky tidbit: sometimes these visits weren't entirely spiritual. Patrons were notorious for using convents as places to stash inconvenient relatives, daughters they didn't want to marry off, widows too costly to support. A fat donation could smooth the entry, which means the smiling noblewoman across the room might also be calculating whether to gift one of her nieces to the cloister soon. The sisters maintain composure, but you sense their discomfort. Visitors disturb the rhythm of cloister life. They bring gossip from the outside world, perfumes too rich, fabrics too bright. And yet, they also bring the coins that keep candles burning. The tension is palpable, needing what unsettles you. One of the patrons leans closer, her voice dropping as she whispers about miracles rumoured in another convent. You can almost see the abbess stiffen, the rivalry again slipping into the room like an uninvited guest. She responds quickly, assuring the woman that this convent's prayers are steadfast and holy, even if statues don't bleed. Her tone is calm, but the shadow of competition lingers. The meeting ends with prayers, bows, and the sound of coins clinking into a wooden chest. The patrons sweep out, their gowns whispering across the stone floor. The sisters exhale as the door closes, their world contracting back into its steady rhythm. You stand in the quiet chamber, staring at the chest now heavy with gold. Behind convent walls, wealth came dressed in piety, but always carried the weight of strings attached. The clink of coins still echoes faintly in your ears as you move deeper into the cloister, but the mood shifts quickly. Whispers rush past you like a chill draught, frightened, urgent. A novice hurries by, her sandals slapping against stone. Her face is pale, and when you glance after her, you notice something odd. She isn't heading toward prayer or work. She's heading for the gate. And that's when you realize it. Someone has run away. Behind convent walls, escape was both rare and scandalous. Once a woman took vows, she was expected to remain for life. A runaway wasn't just a disobedient nun, she was a living embarrassment, a reminder that the cloister could feel more like a prison than paradise. Mainstream fact: historical records do mention escaped nuns, though usually from hostile sources eager to smear convents. Some slipped away to reunite with families, others fled unwanted vows forced upon them by parents. A few even eloped, trading the security of cloistered walls for the dangerous freedom of love. Historians still argue whether most of these escapes were romanticized tales or genuine, desperate bids for liberty. Official church records paint them as cautionary disasters, claiming runaways ended in ruin. But folk stories tell of clever escapes aided by sympathetic villagers, complete with disguises, hidden carts, or forged travel papers. A quirky tidbit: one runaway nun in 15th century Germany supposedly dressed as a soldier, complete with a borrowed sword, and managed to vanish into the chaos of a festival crowd. Imagine the whispers when her absence was discovered, habits rustling with shock, abbess pale with fury. You imagine the tension inside the convent when a sister vanished, the abbess pacing, demanding to know who last saw her. The other nuns torn between guilt and envy. Guilt because they'd been taught escape was sin, envy because sometimes they too dreamed of slipping beyond the gate. And the punishments for those left behind could be harsh. Stricter curfews, harsher surveillance, more inspections. One runaway soured trust for everyone. Even novices who had never thought of leaving suddenly found themselves watched more closely, their letters scrutinized, their freedoms clipped even shorter. You picture the runaway herself, sandals muddy, heart pounding as she runs down a moonlit road. Perhaps she's terrified, whispering frantic prayers as though angels might shield her from discovery. Or perhaps she's exhilarated, tasting freedom in every lungful of night air. Either way, she knows the risk. Capture meant humiliation, public penance, maybe even imprisonment in a convent cell with bread and water for weeks. The other sisters whisper for days afterward. Some pity her, some scorn her, a few secretly admire her bravery. And in the silence of their own beds, many wonder, would I ever dare? Behind convent walls, the runaway problem was more than scandal. It was a crack in the illusion of contentment, proof that vows weren't always chosen, and devotion wasn't always enough to cage the human need for freedom. The whispers of escape still hang in the halls, but soon they're replaced by a heavier hush, the kind that falls when everyone knows punishment is coming. A runaway shakes more than trust. It stirs the abbess to remind the sisters what disobedience costs. Tonight, you witness those costs firsthand. The refectory benches have been cleared. At the center, a novice kneels on the cold flagstone floor, hands folded, eyes fixed on the crucifix hanging above. Her shoulders tremble, though whether from shame or exhaustion is hard to tell. Around her, the rest of the community sits in silence, watching. Punishment here is never private. It is meant to echo, to be remembered. Mainstream fact, monastic rules like the Rule of St. Benedict laid out a range of penances for infractions. Silence, fasting, kneeling for hours, exclusion from communal meals or surviving on bread and water were all common. The idea wasn't cruelty but correction, sin weighed down by hardship until it dissolved into humility. But when you watch a young novice kneel for hours, knees pressed into unyielding stone, back bent beneath the abbess's gaze, it doesn't look like humility. It looks like pain disguised as piety. Historians still argue whether such punishments genuinely fostered discipline or simply bred resentment. Some sisters later wrote of feeling purified by penance, closer to God for their suffering. Others described punishments as crushing, even humiliating, leaving scars that lasted longer than the bruises. A quirky tidbit: in some convents, disobedient sisters had to wear unusual garments as penance, rough hair shirts that itched constantly, or even straw ropes tied around their waists as a reminder of humility. A medieval version of the dunce cap, except scratchier. You notice how the room itself participates in the punishment. The stone floor seems colder, the air sharper, candles flicker more dramatically, casting shadows that stretch like judgment across the walls. The silence of the watching sisters is loud, pressing on the penitent like another weight. It isn't just the abbess punishing her. It's the entire community, their gaze unblinking, their stillness demanding. The novice shifts slightly, wincing. Hours have passed. Her knees must be raw, her muscles screaming, yet no one moves to help. The abbess nods once, allowing her to rise, but not to speak. Tomorrow she will eat only bread and water, her hunger, another reminder of her error. And yet, even in punishment, humanity flickers. As the novice leaves, another sister discreetly slips her a crust of softer bread hidden in her sleeve. A hand squeezes her shoulder in passing, quick enough to escape the abbess's notice. Compassion smuggled inside discipline. You leave the refectory, the echoes of penance following you. The lesson is clear. Inside these walls, disobedience never goes unnoticed. It leaves its mark not only on the punished, but on everyone watching, a reminder of the fine line between obedience and rebellion. Because behind convent walls, punishment was as much theatre as it was correction. A performance meant to shape not just one sister, but the entire community watching. The air after punishment feels heavier, almost metallic, as though silence itself has gained weight. Yet beneath that heaviness, you begin to notice something else, voices rising not in song, but in stories. Some whispered, some written, some carried like flames through the cloister. These are the accounts of visions, the mystical revelations that could shake an entire convent. You wander into the chapel late at night, the candles burning low, their flames barely holding against the draughts. A sister kneels before the altar, body rigid, face pale, eyes wide as if she's seeing something no one else can. Her lips move quickly, whispering words you can't quite catch. Then suddenly she gasps and collapses forward, trembling. The others rush to her side. Did she faint from hunger, or did she just witness heaven itself? Mainstream fact: convents were breeding grounds for mystical visions in the Middle Ages. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Catherine of Siena recorded vivid revelations of Christ, Mary, angels, and even apocalyptic scenes. These visions brought them fame, followers, and sometimes suspicion from church authorities. Historians still argue whether such experiences were genuine spiritual ecstasies, psychosomatic effects of fasting and sleeplessness, or deliberate performances meant to gain prestige. A malnourished body, deprived of sleep, chanting for hours under such strain, hallucinations were almost inevitable. But were they delusion, devotion, or strategy? The debate lingers as heated as ever. Quirky tidbit: some nuns described visions so specific they included culinary details. One reported that Christ himself offered her a morsel of his heart to eat, which she claimed tasted sweeter than honey. Mystical. And a little unsettling, especially if you just came from the refectory's beans. You watch as the sister in front of you lifts her head, eyes glassy, voice trembling, as she speaks of light so bright it seared her sight, of angels singing with voices unlike human sound. The others lean in, half in awe, half in fear. The abbess listens intently, weighing each word. If true, this vision could bring prestige, visitors, and donations. If false, or worse, heretical, it could bring scandal or condemnation. The convent holds its breath. Did heaven touch down in their chapel, or did one sister's exhausted mind slip into illusion? The next day, the story spreads like wildfire through the cloister. Some sisters believe immediately, whispering about God's favor resting on their house. Others are skeptical, muttering that too much fasting can make anyone see stars. A few resent the sudden attention on one sister, quietly jealous of her new status. The abbess orders fasting and prayer, both to honor the vision and to test its endurance. If it is truly divine, it will return. If not, it will fade. Either way, the entire community becomes entangled, their rhythm altered by one woman's trembling words. You step out of the chapel and realize how fragile the line is between miracle and madness. Behind convent walls, a vision could make a saint or a scandal. And as night falls again, you wonder, if you stared long enough at candlelight, chanting psalms until your stomach growled and your body swayed, what would you see? The echoes of visions still shimmer in your mind as you drift deeper into the convent's quieter corridors. It is late, the stones cool underfoot, and you notice two novices lingering in a shadowed archway. Their voices are hushed, too low to catch the words, but their closeness tells you enough. The way one's hand brushes the other's sleeve and lingers just a heartbeat too long, the kind of gesture ordinary in the outside world, but here, charged with risk. Behind convent walls, desire did not vanish. Vows of chastity were sworn, Rules were enforced, and yet the human heart kept its own counsels. Some sisters formed bonds of deep affection, platonic or otherwise, that blurred the tidy lines of piety. Others sought comfort in the most forbidden places, with priests, confessors, or visiting patrons. Mainstream fact, court records and ecclesiastical visitations occasionally reveal scandals involving convent romances. Some tell of priests caught slipping love notes to nuns, or of patrons accused of improper familiarity during visits. Others record rumors of sisters forming intimate attachments with each other, sometimes dismissed as spiritual friendships, sometimes condemned as unnatural vice. Historians still argue how common these romances truly were. Were they widespread realities suppressed in official records, or sensationalized exceptions magnified by critics of convent life? The lack of clear evidence keeps debate alive, but even silence can suggest what words refuse to capture. Quirky tidbit. In 13th century France, inspectors once complained that a convent's garden walls were too low, allowing priests to climb over for nocturnal visits. The abbess was ordered to raise them higher. You can almost picture the embarrassment in that official report, divine enclosure thwarted by bad masonry. You imagine the nervous thrill of secrecy. A sister slipping a folded scrap of parchment into another's prayer book. A priest lingering too long in the confessional, his hand brushing hers through the wooden grate. Two novices sitting shoulder to shoulder during evening prayers, their knees pressing together under woolen habits, hearts racing with fear and exhilaration. And you also imagine the consequences if discovered. Public penance, shorn hair, exile to another house, or worse, expulsion. The shame didn't fall only on the guilty, but on the entire convent, staining its reputation for decades. Donors withdrew support, bishops tightened oversight, rivals spread gossip gleefully. Yet still these romances flickered into being, stubborn as candle flames in draughty halls. Because even in stone enclosures, love found cracks to slip through. Some bonds were fleeting, born of loneliness. Others lasted lifetimes, recorded only in hints, letters that lingered too tenderly, shared burial requests, whispered legends of sisters inseparable in life and in death. You pause under the archway, watching the novices finally step apart at the sound of approaching footsteps. Their faces settle back into composure, their hands fold, their eyes lower. But for a moment you saw it, the rebellion of the heart, fragile and fierce. Because behind convent walls, forbidden romances were not just scandal, they were proof that vows could cage bodies, but never fully chain longing. And sometimes the strongest prayers whispered in these halls were not psalms at all, but the secret confessions of desire. The whispers of desire fade, but another kind of whisper takes their place, darker, more dangerous. You hear it first, in the way villagers mutter at the convent gates, crossing themselves too quickly as they pass. Then in the nervous laughter of novices who claim they saw something strange during evening prayers. Rumours of witchcraft. Behind convent walls, rituals and remedies often blurred into territory outsiders didn't understand. A nun crushing herbs at midnight, chanting a prayer over them, might be seen as a healer within, but as a sorceress without. When illness struck a village, or crops failed, or storms tore through fields, suspicion sometimes pointed to the cloistered women whose lives already seemed uncanny. Mainstream fact, accusations of witchcraft did occasionally target nuns, though less often than laywomen. Their roles as healers and keepers of herbs made them vulnerable. Some inquisitorial records hint at sisters being investigated for superstitious practices, especially if their remedies seemed too effective or too strange. You step into the convent garden again, this time by moonlight. A sister kneels over a bed of herbs, crushing leaves with a stone pestle, murmuring softly. Is it prayer? Is it spellcraft? The line depends on who is watching. To her, it may be invoking God's blessing on the medicine. To a suspicious villager, it might look like conjuring demons in the dark. Historians still argue how much of this was projection from outside and how much came from within. Did sisters truly experiment with charms and forbidden rituals, or did hungry, frightened communities simply need someone to blame? Some scholars argue that convent witchcraft was nothing more than advanced herbal medicine misunderstood. Others suspect at least a few nuns blended folk magic with devotion, carrying traditions from their villages into cloister walls. Quirky tidbit: one convent's visitation records describe nuns keeping strange powders in locked boxes, which they sprinkled on beds to ward off nightmares. Was it lavender, ashes, something less innocent? The record doesn't say, but the bishop demanded the powders be burned, just in case. You imagine the fear of a novice lying awake in her dormitory after hearing the whispers. Did her sister really heal a fever by burying charms under the threshold? Did the flickering shadows in the chapel mean more than candlelight? Fear breeds fast in enclosed spaces, and rumours spiral easily when no outside voice can correct them. The abbess walks a careful line. She must allow herbal remedies, after all, the infirmary needs them, but she must also ban anything that looks too much like sorcery. One whispered accusation could destroy not just a sister's reputation, but the convent's entire standing. You feel the tension in the air, thick as incense. The sisters themselves might laugh nervously at the rumours, but they also tuck their amulets a little deeper into sleeves, whisper their folk charms a little quieter. Belief and fear coexist uneasily, never fully vanishing. Because behind convent walls, witchcraft was less about cauldrons and spells than about perception. What one person called healing, another called heresy. And in those shadowed halls, even a pinch of dried herbs could become a spark for scandal. The rumours of witchcraft die down, at least for now, but another truth presses in. This convent was never just a spiritual retreat. It was also a political pawn. You notice it when a group of visitors arrives at the gate. Not humble pilgrims this time, but heralds bearing the crests of a powerful, noble house. Their message is clear: a daughter has been sent to join, not because she chose it, but because the family wills it. You watch as the new arrival steps through the gates. She wears a fine gown, her hair still shining with oils, her face pale not from prayer, but from shock. She has not come willingly. Her father, eager to avoid paying a dowry, decided she would serve God instead. Her brothers, anxious to secure their inheritance, signed the documents that sealed her fate. The abbess greets her with calm words, but you can see the young woman's eyes dart toward the still open gate, as if memorizing her last glimpse of freedom. Mainstream fact. Many convents were filled with women from wealthy families who had little choice in their vocation. Aristocratic daughters were often placed here to preserve family wealth, maintain alliances, or keep them safe from undesirable marriages. The cloister became not only a house of God, but a chessboard square in dynastic strategy. Historians still argue whether these placements granted women unexpected influence, since some noble-born nuns later rose to be powerful abbesses, or whether they stripped them of agency altogether. A convent might have freed a daughter from a brutal arranged marriage, but it also caged her into another life she didn't choose. Quirky tidbit: one English convent kept meticulous records of dowry equivalents, horses, land deeds, even barrels of wine, paid by families to secure their daughter's entry. The ledger reads less like a spiritual register and more like a shopping list of aristocratic bargaining chips. Inside the cloister, the arrival of a noble daughter shifts the balance. Her presence might bring wealth, books, or even political protection, but it might also bring tension. Other sisters resent her privilege. Some whisper that she'll never adapt to the plain food, the cold dormitory, the endless prayers. They're not wrong. On her first night, she weeps into her straw mattress, muffling sobs so the others won't hear. You can feel the clash. The convent preaches humility, but hierarchy seeps in through bloodlines. A peasant-born novice scrubs pots in the kitchen, while the new noble might be steered quickly toward the scriptorium or choir, places of prestige. The abbess insists all are equal before God, but everyone knows some voices echo louder in Rome when complaints are sent. And sometimes politics creep even deeper. A powerful patron might insist his daughter receive lighter penances or more lenient rules. The abbess, balancing survival, might concede. Fairness bends, discipline strains. The other sisters notice. Resentment smoulders. You walk the halls and realize how little cloister life was untouched by the outside world. Even here, inside thick walls, the hands of fathers, brothers, and kings reach in, placing pawns on the board. Because behind convent walls, vows of humility often carried the weight of dynastic ambition, and for some women the veil was not a calling, but a contract. The clang of the gate behind that unwilling noble daughter still lingers when you hear another sound, softer, subtler, but no less disruptive. It's the murmur of discontent spreading through the dormitories, whispered in kitchens, exchanged in the gardens. This is the pulse of rebellion, not the grand kind with swords and banners. No, inside these walls, rebellion was quieter, woven into everyday acts. A novice refusing to kneel for an extra psalm. A sister rolling her eyes at the abbess during a lecture. A kitchen helper slipping an extra onion into the pot despite ration orders. Each tiny act alone seems trivial, but together they form a current strong enough to rattle stone. Mainstream fact, convent records sometimes preserve shocking glimpses of open revolt. In 14th century Spain, a group of nuns locked their abbess out of her own convent, refusing to let her return until the bishop intervened. In France, another abbess was nearly dragged from her chair by furious sisters demanding less harsh penances. These weren't frequent, but they happened, proof that cloisters weren't immune to human politics. Historians still argue whether these uprisings were driven by genuine spiritual conviction or by plain exhaustion with poor leadership. Was a strict abbess enforcing holiness or simply abusing authority? Was a rebellion the work of disobedient women or the only way to demand justice in a system stacked against them? Quirky tidbit, in some convents, rebellions took almost comic forms. One account tells of nuns staging a silent protest by refusing to sing properly in choir, humming tunelessly until the abbess relented on stricter fasting rules. Imagine the sound, an entire choir buzzing like disgruntled bees instead of chanting psalms. Effective? Perhaps more than one sermon ever was. You wander through the dormitory and catch it in action. A novice lingers in bed after the bell, feigning illness. Another, tasked with copying scripture, doodles flowers in the margins as protest. In the kitchen, a sister hums a forbidden folk song while chopping vegetables, each note a defiance disguised as melody. And sometimes resistance turned into true confrontation. You imagine a heated chapter meeting, voices rising, sisters arguing openly with the abbess. Some cry, some shout, some sit stony-faced. The abbess slams her hand on the table, reminding them of vows. But vows can bend under the weight of hunger, cold, and resentment. The punishments for rebellion could be severe: public penance, transfers to harsher convents, even expulsion. Yet still, uprisings happened, because walls can enclose bodies, but not silence dissatisfaction forever. You realize as you listen that rebellion here wasn't about overthrowing the church or tearing down the cloister. It was about survival, about claiming scraps of autonomy in a life where every moment was regulated. Refusing an order, whispering a complaint, humming off-key, each was a declaration. I am still here. I still have a voice. Behind convent walls, rebellion didn't roar. It murmured, but those murmurs shaped lives as surely as bells did. And if you lean close enough, you can still hear them, echoing faintly in the stone. The memory of rebellion still hums in the walls as you follow the path toward the convent cemetery. A heavy wooden door creaks open, and the air shifts, cooler, quieter, laced with the scent of wax and damp earth. Death here is not a disruption, but a rhythm as constant as bells. You step into a narrow chapel where a body lies beneath a shroud. The sisters gather around, their voices low, chanting psalms that rise and fall like waves. The sound isn't dramatic, it's steady, practiced. These rites have been spoken so many times that they seem to flow from the stone itself. A crucifix hangs above, its candlelight flickering across worn wood, the wax dripping like slow tears. Mainstream fact: convents had detailed rituals for the death of a sister. The body was washed, clothed in her habit, and placed before the altar for vigil prayers. Burial often happened within the convent grounds, in simple graves marked with wooden crosses or, for wealthier houses, stone slabs. In some places, the deceased's possessions were redistributed among the community: shoes, rosaries, even bedding, reminders of equality in death. You picture the sisters filing past the shrouded figure, each pausing to sprinkle holy water or place a hand briefly on the cloth. Their faces are composed, but you catch the flicker of grief in their eyes. For all the rules and rivalries, this was one of their own. They lived together in cold dormitories, chanted side by side in chapel, weeded the same stubborn herbs in the garden. Now one voice has fallen silent. Historians still argue whether these funerals offered comfort or simply reinforced discipline. On the one hand, they emphasized humility: no fine coffins, no gilded tombs, just plain earth. On the other, they reminded sisters that even death couldn't free them from the cloister. The graveyard was yet another enclosure. Quirky tidbit: in some convents, skulls of deceased sisters were kept in special ossuaries, sometimes painted with inscriptions or symbols. Imagine walking past shelves of your predecessors' faces every day, each hollow gaze a sermon on mortality. It wasn't morbid to them, it was devotional. But you can't help shivering a little. You notice how practical the ritual is. While prayers continue, another sister prepares the grave outside. Soil damp, the air thick with loam. There is no grand mourning procession, no public spectacle. Just a small community folding death into its daily rhythm. Tomorrow, prayers and beans will continue as usual. And yet, in the silence of the burial, something tender slips through. A novice wipes her tears quickly, pretending it's the cold air. Another sister lingers an extra moment at the grave, tracing the wooden cross as if whispering a secret goodbye. Even here, where discipline reigns, love resists erasure. As you leave the cemetery, you glance back at the rows of simple crosses. No names carved in gold, no epitaphs boasting lineage or deeds, just wood, earth, and silence. Behind convent walls, death was stripped of ornament, but not of meaning. Each grave whispered the same truth: vows ended not in release, but in rest. The cemetery's quiet lingers in your ears, but beyond the convent walls a louder storm gathers. You feel it in the air. An unease not born of whispered gossip or small rebellions, but of something vast sweeping across Europe. The Reformation has arrived, and its shockwaves crash straight into cloister doors. You imagine the abbess pacing in her chamber, clutching a letter sealed with a bishop's crest. News spreads, convents accused of corruption, of idleness, of superstition. Reformers rail against the very idea of women enclosed, claiming vows are forced, relics are frauds, visions are delusions.